This is Duke University.
Okay, I think we're ready to get started back up here. I'm going to begin by introducing our moderator for this panel, and he will go on to introduce our panelists. First, I want to say welcome to Kip Viscusi, who's joining us from Colorado. Hello, thank you for being here. Daniel S. Bolling III is a senior lecturing fellow here at Duke Law, where his primary focus is the law of the workplace. He's also a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches and works with Martin Seligman, the so-called father of positive psychology. Prior to joining the academic world, Dan was a partner in a large law firm and then the global head of human resources for Coca-Cola Enterprises, where he was responsible for welfare initiatives affecting 80,000 employees. Dan has a BA from Millsaps College, a JD from Duke, and a Master of Positive Psychology from Penn. For the past 3 years at Duke, Dan has worked to bridge the gap between happiness science and the study of law by teaching a course called Well-Being in the Practice of Law, which was recently featured in an American Lawyer cover story. He's currently working on longitudinal studies at Emory and American law schools, exploring the links between well-being and law school outcomes, and he speaks and writes on these topics frequently. We're honored to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's super important that anyone who speaks and wants Kip to hear them to speak into a microphone. So he won't be able to hear any noise from the room otherwise.
Thank you very much. What a great day this has been, and what a great job, Katie, you and the team of the Duke Law Journal have done putting this on. I thank you all right now. And thank you for that kind introduction. You referenced some studies that I'm working on linking, exploring happiness in law students. I imagine some of you in the back might be interested in some of the results of that, but that's a topic for another panel and another day, or you can take my course next fall, you two. All right, it's appropriate we have a symposium on well-being here at Duke. Particularly appropriate is as the Greek scholars are in the room know, or all of you, the Greek word eudaimonia, which we've heard a lot today, often associated with Aristotelian notions of happiness. Does anyone know what it actually means in Greek? Good, pardon?
Well-blessed.
Well-blessed, or the actual word, good demon.
Demon.
Good demons. So here at Duke, we think we're all good demons. So you're among a eudaimonic crowd to our guests. Thank you. We have a great panel here today, scholars. After I introduce them, I'd like them to discuss their papers with us. And then after that, I'm going to be kind of like John Calipari, the basketball coach at Kentucky, kind of roll the ball on the field and let the stars play. And so I encourage you to engage with one another. And obviously, our authors have shown great willingness to engage. I'm sure you have lots of questions, lots of observations, and also something from the audience too would be very welcome. So with that, let me first introduce Jennifer Nou. Jennifer is a public law fellow at the University of Chicago Law School. Her scholarship focuses on issues of administrative law, election law, and legislative and statutory interpretation. Prior to going to Chicago, the professor worked at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs as a policy analyst and a special assistant to Cass Sunstein. Professor Nou received her BA from Yale, Master's in Philosophy in Politics from Oxford, and her JD from Yale. She served as law clerk to Judge Posner on the Seventh Circuit and Justice Breyer on the United States Supreme Court. Welcome, Jennifer. Next, we have Lisa Robinson, Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School for Center for Business and Government, and a Research Associate at the Harvard School of Public Health. Her work focuses on the evaluation of human health and environmental benefits and the use of cost-benefit and cost-effectiveness analysis in public policy and regulatory decision-making. Previously, Ms. Robinson worked at the Harvard Center for Risk Analysis and was a principal at Industrial Economics. She managed there a number of large-scale projects conducting cost-benefit analyses and assessing the impact of major regulations on the EPA and other agencies. She received her BA from Carleton College, Minnesota, right? And her Master's in Public Policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Finally, visiting us, welcome, Kip.
Hi.
That's Kip. Kip Viscusi is a distinguished professor at Vanderbilt University with primary appointments at the Law School, the Owen Graduate School of Management, and the Department of Economics. The professor's research governs health and safety risks, including risky behaviors, government regulation, and tort liability. He has served as a consultant to the U.S. Office of Management and Budget and a number of federal agencies on issues pertaining to the valuation of life and health. Before going to Vandy, Professor Viscusi was the Kogan Professor of Law and Economics and Director of the Program of Empirical Legal Studies at Harvard Law School. He has also served as the Allen Professor of Economics here at Duke University and a Professor of Economics at Northwestern. Professor Viscusi received his AB, MPP, AM, and PhD, all from Harvard University. Welcome. So now let's just start first with you, Jennifer, and if you'd be so kind.
Sure. So, like everyone else, I benefited enormously from reading the papers and from the discussions today. And really the purpose of my comments is to try and situate even further some of the discussions that we've been having in a really deeply institutional context. And I want to make one principal claim, which is that reasonable people and even experts are going to disagree about various dimensions of well-being analysis, how to measure it, the right methodologies for doing it, and when to use it, and ultimately how these deep disagreements are going to be resolved are through various policymaking institutions. And I think this lens really hopefully brings to the fore two dimensions that I think haven't been spoken about as much today as they might. The first is really the different kinds of actors that are going to be involved within these institutions. Everyone from economists to lawyers to physicians, to policy analysts, to elected officials. It's going to vary in each of these institutional contexts, and I would encourage us to continue to think about what kinds of groups of institutional actors are appropriate when. And I say when because the second dimension that I hope to kind of bring to the fore a little bit more is a different kind of temporal dimension, and that is the different stages of the rulemaking process and the life cycle of a rule. One of my contentions would be that some of these questions are going to be resolved differently at, for example, the pre-proposal stage. In other words, we might be wanting to talk more about well-being analysis then versus when the rule is proposed and it goes to notice and comment. And of course, the final rule has to be a logical outgrowth of that discussion, in which case a different kind of discussion, different sort of factors, and a different set of actors might become involved. And so I would encourage us really to think about these different stages, which of course is all ex ante, and then we have Jonathan Wiener's point about ex post. And recent executive orders have really tried to encourage us to evaluate, in its ex post manner, some of the regulatory impacts. So I'll just say a few brief things. First, about some of the reasons for what I've been calling these deep disagreements about well-being analysis. Then I'll just say a word or two about the various institutions. We've already talked about a lot of them. And then finally, just highlight considerations that might differ across these institutions, and to think about how to design the procedures and those institutions for eventually resolving these issues. So first, just why might some of these issues that we've been talking about be deeper rather than shallow? Okay, that is, why might they be more intractable than something that we think that we can resolve through technical refinement? The first is simply that they implicate, the ends rather than the means of government. Okay, so I'd submit that some of the discussions that we've been having about whether it's, life satisfaction versus moment-to-moment happiness really implicate questions that might vary not only across different issue domains, but also, as we've talked about, across countries. So, for example, Bhutan, has adopted this gross national happiness, and theirs is very much a life satisfaction approach. Okay, and the questions they kind of ask very much reflect their own cultural considerations. China, by contrast, apparently measures harmoniousness as one of the right measures to think about, and that reflects a deep set of institutional and cultural concerns. And then finally, although it sounds like it's changing with the National Academy of Sciences, but right now the current federal government data collection efforts only focus on moment-to-moment happiness in the American Time Use Survey, but we might see more evaluative measures happening as well. Quickly, the second main reason why these issues might be deep rather than shallow is they really ask questions about the right conceptual buckets for happiness and how they map onto positive or negative affect. So, for example, this American Time Use Survey that I've mentioned asks questions like, has this particular experience, working, socializing, and so on, made you happy, tired, sad, stressed, or in pain. And, we could have reasonable disagreements about what the potential impacts of, say, stress would be on a positive or negative affect. And there's some research to suggest that that relationship is not necessarily straightforward, and experts can disagree about that. Finally, and I won't say too much about it because I think it's already been one of the key themes of today, which is we're going to have hybrid measures. We're going to have some impacts that are going to be monetized and quantified, and some that just can't be or aren't, and maybe they shouldn't be. And how to trade those off is really going to be determined through institutional procedures. What are those institutional procedures? Okay, that's the second main just kind of point I want to make. We've already heard a little bit that Congress is going to be some of the places where these decisions are already going to be made. We have statutes that tell us the decision can't be based on cost, which you can just think about as a legislative decision, right? That cost-benefit analysis is not the right way to think about things. So, for example, the National Living Air Quality Standard says, look, that standard has to be requisite to protect public health. And various courts, Whitman, and in various cases have said you can't consider costs. The second, we've heard a lot about it, is the executive branch, headed by coordinated by the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs. We've heard a lot about Circular A4, which is the authoritative document, and it's going to be a mediated institutional discussion, okay, between the executive branch agencies, but also these White House offices, like the Council of Economic Advisors, the Domestic Policy Council, okay, about these issues of deep disagreement that have, in particular documents, been decided to use particular figures to avoid having to relitigate for every particular rule which discount rates to use. So we're going to use 3% and 7% discount rates and just present them that way. And you're going to see, I think, iterated through these institutions, that institutional kind of discussion where supplemental guidance will then say at the agency level, okay, that other kinds of discussions should be used. And so that's the other institutional discussion arena at the specific agencies. For example, the EPA has a 272-page guidance document that's a supplement to Circular A4 about how they do their cost-benefit analyses, and they're going to make these decisions. Let me just close by highlighting the considerations at each of these institutional levels and the way they might differ. The first is simply through the amount of public participation that each of these institutions will invite. Okay, so at the agency level, I already mentioned that notice and comment is one process that public interaction occurs, but also the guidance documents. So for example, Circular A4 was subject to notice and comment. Okay, and that was very much an attempt, I think, to get various voices in the room discussing some of these issues of deep disagreement. The second is where you want to pilot and test, a lot of these kind of well-being analysis measures, in particular issue arenas. Okay, so you might think that particular issues, say nuclear policy, okay, might not be the right kind of issue to debate about well-being analysis at the legislative level yet. So maybe we want it just at the agency level where we have experts who have been thinking about these decisions to be debating these issues for the time being. And then finally, another dimension is related to that, which is how can we learn through what we have, the information that we've gained at the agency level. And I think that learning, again, is going to occur through piloting and testing, and that's going to filter up and inform the discussion that eventually happens at the executive branch level and then also to Congress. And I would encourage us to continue to think about all of these considerations as well as how transparent they are. And just to take home Jonathan Weiner's point that, we started this day by saying, look, this is a very democratic process. And to think about the different democratic institutions that are involved, research has also shown that by itself can also increase subjective well-being.
Thank you, Jennifer. Lisa?
Oops. So one of the dangers of being on the last panel is that you feel like you've already said everything that you were going to say, or somebody else already said it even better than you might have said it. But so some of this is going to be repetition, but I think it's important enough that I'd like to reiterate it. As I said earlier, I've spent most of my career doing benefit cost analysis, so I feel much more positively about it than these three. Or at least I think I do. But my experience has also been that benefit cost analysis is not the only type of information we want to bring to the table. I think that bringing it to the table information on well-being as well as on lots of other things can be very useful. I think the challenge right now is to develop well-being analysis to the point that we have a better idea of what it is that we're trying to measure and how to best measure it, which I think gets to some of the things that Matt's been saying. Benefit cost analysis answers a very particular question. How can we best allocate scarce resources given how we understand people's preferences. And by preferences, we mean people's willingness to trade money, which they could use to buy other things, for the benefits provided by a particular regulation or policy. Well-being analysis asks a slightly different question. How can we best allocate resources given how our understanding of individuals' self-reported well-being? These are both, to me, interesting questions that are worth understanding better. I do think, though, that it's been interesting listening to you guys here because I think that you're much more open to having both types of analysis than I think comes across in your paper. And I think that it'd be nice to see that come across in your paper because I think that your argument would be stronger if it recognized that benefit cost analysis does have some strengths, and that the path to implementing well-being analysis has there's some hard work left to do. In writing this up before I heard everybody talk today, I was thinking I'd talk about 3 myths about benefit cost analysis, 3 challenges, and 1 concluding thought. And as I've been scribbling notes, my concluding thoughts have gotten longer and longer, so you'll tell me when I'm out of time, right? I decided, Kip, to stay away from the VSL issues because I figured you'd do a much better job than I will of talking about the VSL. Anyways, I think that the first myth is that benefit cost analysis is useful only because there are no alternatives. And I think there's 2 problems with this statement. And one is that, as I said before, benefit cost analysis I think really is useful. And part of what makes it useful is that it's a well-established framework that motivates us to research the physical impacts of different policy options. It's not just about coming up with economic values. I think another advantage is that it provides information on the intensity of people's preferences and their willingness to make the types of trade-offs that are implicit in many policy decisions. We are asking people to spend money in order to have whatever outcome the policy would provide. At the same time, it doesn't preclude consideration of non-quantifiable effects, uncertainty distribution, a number of other things. I also think that it promotes a broad perspective. I think the danger is that decision makers will simply assume that everybody else shares their preferences or they'll just override everybody's preferences without the information that a benefit cost analysis provides on how those affected balance the benefits and costs. The second problem with the statement is that there are lots of alternatives, and we've talked about several of them today. There's methods that are particularly powerful when we don't have the ability to fully quantify benefits, like cost-effectiveness analysis and break-even analysis. We're concerned about the distribution of impacts. Jonathan's written about feasibility analysis, or against feasibility analysis, I guess. But there are a lot of options. I think the second myth is that the way we do benefit valuation now doesn't account for emotional or psychological effects or mental states, using Matt's language. Economists aren't entirely naive. We do realize that people have psychological responses to the attributes of different goods and services or outcomes affect the decisions that they make about how to spend money. When we look for valuation studies to use in benefit cost analyses, we think about the characteristics of the risk as well as the characteristics of who's affected. I think a good example is some work that I did to come up with a way of valuing mortality risk reductions associated with Homeland Security regulations. And a very large section of the review that we did had to do with thinking about the psychological responses to the risk, the fact that Homeland Security or the terrorism type risks are viewed as involuntarily incurred, not as under one's control, they're particularly feared, those sorts of things. So we weren't asking the same sort of questions or using the same types of scale that a well-being analysis would use, but we were trying to account for these sorts of psychological attributes. I think a major contribution of well-being analysis is that it highlights one of those attributes, this subjective well-being or happiness, however we ultimately decide we want to measure it. The third myth is that the goal of benefit cost analysis is to increase wealth or favors the wealthy. I think that where this comes from is this idea that willingness to pay increases with income. But I think that it's missing, there's some subtleties that kind of statement is missing. The first is that we accommodate in benefit cost analysis individual preferences for spending on outcomes that aren't traded in markets like cleaner air or scenic vistas. So in money terms, we may be becoming poorer because we're paying to clean up pollution or whatever it is that's creating the problem, but we get this non-monetary good, which is the being able to enjoy the outdoors, breathing, things like that. The second point is that although economists argue for using net benefits as a decision criteria, or at least many economists do, those same economists make the argument that the reason for doing that is because distributional effects can be handled better by the tax and income support system. So it's not that they're advocating that we make rich people richer. They're advocating that we use the tax system to take away the gains from those who benefit the most and redistribute them to the losers. The third is something that's not so intrinsic to benefit cost analysis, but is true about how we apply it in the U.S., which is that regulatory agencies usually use population-wide averages for evaluation, regardless of whether regulation disproportionately affects people who are rich or people who are poor. Part of the reason why we do that is that we have some major gaps in the research literature, but it's often advocated as being more equitable. Whether or not you think this is really fair really depends on how you define fairness. The use of averages, of course, might not reflect the preferences of those who are affected for how to allocate the resources. So turning to the challenges for further developing well-being analysis, I think the first is that we need to figure out some criteria for selecting values. I think this comes across in both the example that you guys had in your paper and in some of the things that Matt was saying. When sorry, I just lost a page in my notes. See if I can remember what I was going to say. When we do benefit cost analysis, we have there's this line between theory, how we'd ideally like to measure things, the types of data or measurements we have available. Have to stop?
3 minutes.
3 minutes? Okay. And that helps us figure out, of all the different studies that are out there, which ones should we use, what are the uncertainties associated with that work, and allows us to explain to the decision makers how they should interpret the results of our analysis. The second, I think the second challenge has come up before, which is this issue of how do we deal with distribution. I think if we think of benefit cost analysis as a supplement to, as well-being analysis as a supplement to cost-benefit analysis, then this problem goes away. When we're measuring benefits and costs in monetary terms, we can redistribute money, but I don't know how you redistribute well-being. So to the extent that a regulation has winners or losers, it doesn't give us a good way to deal with that. I'll skip to a final point, which is that I am concerned about this idea of respecting people's preferences that comes up in this paternalism point that comes up in some of what Matt says. I think that we can correlate measures of happiness with people's income levels, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they would give up that amount of income to have that level of happiness. And I think that we need to explicitly recognize that when we're doing well-being analysis, we are reflecting a decision by the analysts that that's the right thing to be maximizing.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Kip? Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, happy to join everybody there, at least remotely. Today's a fresh powder day in Steamboat Springs, so I think I'll give myself a 9 out of 10 on the happiness score. A lot of the papers, a lot of the discussion was focusing on a critique of benefit cost analysis. And I think that these critiques probably resonate more with law professors than with economists. Most economists I know don't have any sleepless nights worrying about whether benefit cost analysis is a good approach. I noticed most of the cites in the paper, or at least the Bronstein paper, are from law professors who seem disturbed by it rather than economists. As Lisa indicated, I'm going to focus primarily on the value of statistical life, which is a topic I have a vested interest in. It's a cardinal measure, so it's not an ordinal measure. So it's a measure of people's risk-money trade-off for small probabilities of death. So the median estimate out there back in $2,000 is about $7 million. So in current dollars, it's like $8 or $9 million. So it's, at least we have a firm number for the value of statistical life. And government agencies now are using numbers anywhere from $6 to $8 million. And a lot of the agencies are trying to reassess what is the right number that they should be using. I'll come back to that. Let me say something about the happiness scores. Professor Adler's very nice paper reviewed the different happiness survey approaches, like you could ask people on a scale of 0 to 10 how happy you are today, 1 to 10, so you could leave 0 out, 1 to 7. And the question I raised in my commentary is, how do you actually approach answering this question? So, am I evaluating my happiness relative to how I felt yesterday, relative to my peers, relative to the people who live in my neighborhood? So even the thought process that you're engaged in, I think, is not actually that clear cut. In addition, let's say you're disabled. Am I valuing my happiness conditional on being disabled? Or should I be taking a broader perspective and evaluate my happiness if I could be free of this disability, what would my happiness be? And then rescale what my happiness score is. The ordinal measure issue came up a lot in this morning's discussion that I was able to listen to on the webcast of the conference. And the problem I have with ordinal measures is that's exactly what they are, ordinal measures. So one example of an ordinal measure, if the tallest player on the Duke basketball team, Mason Plumlee, give him a 5, and the shortest starting player on the Duke team, Quinn Cook, give him a 1, that would be a valid cardinal measure if Mason Plumlee was 5 times as tall as Quinn Cook. Now he's taller, but not 5 times as tall. And because it's not a cardinal measure, you can't do a lot with it that a lot of people have tried. You can't treat it like a cardinal measure. It only has ordinal significance. So there's no reason to believe that moving from 6 to 8 is twice as valuable as moving from 6 to 7. There's no reason to believe that across people, a 2-point movement on the happiness score is the same for all people. So the intervals don't necessarily have the same value across people and even within a person. So it's hard to figure out what to make of a particular happiness score. In addition, the happiness scores, I think these scales tend to be fairly coarse. Whether it's 0 to 10, 1 to 7, these are very rough measures of happiness. I can only think of one government policy that's ever affected my happiness score. And that's during the Vietnam War. I faced the prospect of being drafted. They instituted a lottery system where they drew lottery numbers, and if you had a good number, you wouldn't have to go to Vietnam. And I got a great number, so I didn't have to go. And yes, my happiness went up. But there's nothing else the government has done since then that's either lowered or raised my happiness score. I think that's probably true of a lot of government policies. If we were to make a job risk-free, I don't think it would change the typical worker's happiness score. The average worker gets a few $100s a year for the average job risk, which is about 1 chance in 25,000 of being killed in a given year. If you were to reduce that risk from 1 chance in 25,000 to 0, I don't think that worker's happiness score would jump up from 7 to 8. It'd probably stay the same. The other problems I discuss in the paper regarding the happiness measures is that there may be ceiling or floor effects. So let's say my income is $20,000, but I feel pretty good, and I'll give myself a 7. If you told me, well, we're going to give you Bill Gates' entire fortune, that's really great. You know, it's increased my happiness almost 50%. It gets me up from, from a 7 to a 10. But my guess is that it actually does more to your well-being than that small movement along the happiness scale. Floor effects could come into play as well. So if I'm having a really crappy day, I might say today's a 0. But if you told me, well, I could be captured and tortured, I think I want to have some negative numbers in there as well, because that's probably even worse than having a bad day. In the Bronstein paper, they give examples of how they would replace the value of statistical life measure with happiness scores. So the average person has a happiness score of about 7.4, and what they would do is multiply that by the number of years of remaining life expectancy to calculate the value of your life. Well, if you do that, you're assuming that each year of life has the same value. And that's certainly inconsistent with my empirical results, where we showed that the value of a statistical life year rises and falls over the life cycle. Also, it would be highly controversial. Senior citizen groups would not be particularly enthusiastic about being told that, if you have 10 years of remaining life expectancy, the value of your life is 10 times, 7.4. But at birth, with 80 years of remaining life expectancy, it's 80 times 7.4. So we're going to target all the government policies to save the lives of children. It's also not consistent with individual preferences, wholly apart from the fact that it may be unpopular. Another deficiency of their approach is that there's no discounting of the evaluations across time. And if you're not going to discount the evaluations of different years of life, it's always desirable to postpone expenditures on life-saving activities as far off into the future if saving lives gets to be cheaper. So if we can save lives 200 years from now, less expensively than we can save lives today, you'll never save lives today. You should always wait unless you're going to do some sort of discounting. Finally, let me turn to some of the value of statistical life mechanics that they worry about. They're concerned that wealth effects matter. Well, why should rich people have a higher value of life? Well, I'd be worried if they weren't willing to spend more on safety. It's certainly borne out in terms of the expenditures people make on cars. The car I have probably has an extra $30,000 or $40,000 worth of safety-related features, and I don't think we want to require everybody to spend $75,000 on a car just so they can share in the same safety features that I wanted. From the standpoint of the government does not make distinctions between rich people and poor people. As Lisa pointed out, they use the same number, one size fits all for everybody. Although in the economics department, in the economics field, we have developed valuations that do depend on income. Age is something the government does not count after EPA got hammered for doing so in one sensitivity analysis. But economists have estimates of how value of statistical varies with age. So it's something we can't do even if government agencies don't. Cancer. The government, values everything like an acute accident. They don't take into account EP's 50% higher value for cancer. Value for cancer in the United Kingdom. And I've written 3 papers on the values of cancer risk going back to my time at Duke.
Okay, Kip, excuse me, your mic is cutting out a little bit.
There. Is that
No.
Am I on?
You're on.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just conclude. In terms of the happiness literature, it seems to me that it's about the same place where the contingent valuation literature was at the time of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. So I think it's a promising approach, but in terms of actually being ready for prime time or use in a policy context, I don't think it's ready yet. So that's the end of my prepared remarks.
Thank you very much, Kip. Thank you, Jennifer, and Lisa as well. Believe it or not, Kip, there's a question a hand being raised. I think it's a question for you. Is that? Yes, it is. It's Mr. Brunstein.
Okay. I'd just like to take a crack at responding to some of the things that Kip said. You know, we've been, and I know that, I don't know which parts of earlier in the day you've been able to see Kip or hear. We've been very conciliatory toward and friendly toward cost-benefit analysis, and not that vigorous at all in defending well-being analysis. But I think that I have to respond to many of the things that you said, so I'll try to do that. So first of all, because I think, you know, Lisa has helpfully tried to clear up misunderstandings about CBA, and there are obviously a lot of misunderstandings about WBA that we should talk about. First of all, you say, Kip, that you don't think you've ever been affected by a government policy. Your happiness has never been affected by a government policy except for, you know, the one about the Vietnam War. But I think that that maybe misunderstands what's going on in well-being analysis. You know, if you reduce, if a population of a million people is subjected to either a 1 in 10,000 risk or a 2 in 10,000 risk of death, and a government policy reduces the risk from 2 in 10,000 to 1 in 10,000, and as a result, 100 fewer people die, that's going to be counted tremendously in well-being analysis, whether or not it affects the happiness of the other people who would have lived either way, and it should be counted a lot. So it doesn't really matter whether, you know, your happiness hasn't been affected. If you weren't one of those people, the happiness of those people is what's being counted and what should be counted. You point out, you know, there are these issues with cardinality and WBA, but as we've talked about throughout the day, those mirror the issues with cardinality with CBA, in my opinion. You don't know that $100 means the same thing to two different people. For one thing, it doesn't because of wealth effects, but even absent wealth effects, it doesn't necessarily contribute to two different people's utility equally. You know, torture being worse than 0 is a great point, but that's why in our paper we talk about how the scale should be -10 to 10, accounting for, you know, possibilities that could be worse than neutral affect, which is what we think of as death equating to neutral affect. And you know, you say the scale is coarse, but that's not what Carol Graham said earlier. She's found in looking into this, there's a bell curve when you use 0 to 10, and she thinks that there'd be the same bell curve if you used 0 to 50 or 0 to 100 or 0 to 1,000,000, which of course you could use to test that, and probably you'd find that it doesn't really make any difference. As for the 18-year-old versus the 90-year-old, CBA and WBA are both about welfare, not about ultimate moral choices. So it might be that if you could decide what to say of a 90-year-old or an 18-year-old, you should flip a coin as a moral, as a matter of morality. That's possible. But CBA and WBA aren't about that. They're about what would save the most welfare. And personally, I think it is indefensible to argue that saving the average 90-year-old would increase welfare as much as saving the average 18-year-old, because saving a 90-year-old will prolong life for a couple of years, whereas saving an 18-year-old will prolong life for, 70 years. That's a big difference in welfare terms. Now, that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do necessarily, but we're not talking about the right thing to do. We're talking about welfare as an input into what the right thing to do is, and the welfare difference is very large. Finally, on discounting, I think that there are a couple of reasons, as we say in the paper, for discounting, one of which goes away if you use WBA, which is that money changes value from one period of time to another period of time, and you don't need to worry about that when you're not trying to convert everything into money. Now, there may be other reasons, as you point out, that you still need to discount, and we are amenable to that and agree. But eliminating one of the two reasons greatly simplifies the process and avoids some of the difficulties in the process.
Now, Jonathan's going to say some more things. I just have a few quick comments. John covered a lot of territory. Kip, this is really great. Getting to talk about the mechanics of CBA with you, Kip, is kind of like talking about the mechanics of a jump shot with Larry Bird. So this is really exciting for us. Just a couple of quick things, as I said. So, if you don't like the way that we're sort of talking about calculating values of life over time, number of years lost times average value of that year, we agree, right? There's no reason why those calculations have to be linear. We could find out how much a 46-year-old values her life and how much a 47-year-old values her life and so forth, or even, a 47-year-old at this income level, a 47-year-old living in that state, whatever else. It could be as precise and fine-grained as you want it to be. And still sort of function the same way. As for value of statistical life mechanics, and I said something about this earlier. So there are obviously a lot of reasons why values of statistical lives would differ among different sorts of people, right? So certainly one possible reason. So certainly age should make a difference, and that's I think exactly our point. Is that it makes sense that people will have different VSLs at different ages. And certainly wealthier people, are to some degree leading better lives, and so it makes sense that they would value their life more. But in addition to valuing their lives more, if they're leading better lives, they're probably also valuing the money they have much less because of the diminished marginal utility of that money. So, there are going to be wealth effects involved in that. And the problem with the wealth effect is not that it's wrong somehow. I mean, that still represents how much that person would be willing to pay. The problem is when we do a study of one population of people at one level of income and then take that study and apply it to a different population of people at a different level of income, or even take an average level and apply it, to a different population of people. And we're effectively asking people to take or sell goods at prices that they themselves would not necessarily want to pay. And then then the last thing I'll say about this, and this is, I think, maybe one of the most important things you said and cuts to the very heart of this, is that, when we see, let's suppose somebody suffers a debilitating injury, and their well-being diminishes immediately after they suffer the injury, and then we see it climb over time. So one question we should have is, exactly as you said, are people rescaling? Are they evaluating their condition based on being disabled and comparing themselves to other disabled people, or are those sort of true reflections of how happy they actually are? And I think that's a crucial and really important question. One indication that at least the initial change immediately after the injury represents a true change in how that person is feeling is simply the fact that they must, it seems totally logical to assume that they must be evaluating themselves with respect to the way they were the day before the injury, immediately prior. They haven't adjusted to their new life at all. They wouldn't be renorming their scale immediately. And then as we see adaptation over time, which of course is one of the major findings in the hedonic psychology, now it's a lot more uncertain. What does that adaptation mean? Is that renorming of the scale, or is that true changes in subjective well-being? And I guess our suggestion is that if that's just renorming of the scale, we should see that consistently. But actually, people adapt very differently, and sometimes not at all, to certain types of effects over time. Earlier in the day, Matt said that people don't adapt at all to unemployment. And so the fact that we get different adaptations effects over time, the fact that there are different sort of temporal curves with respect to these things, seems to indicate that we're picking up something real, not just consistent renorming of the scale.
Thank you very much. Kip, you're going to have time to respond, but I believe Matthew Adler has a comment.
Well, I
need you to talk into the mic. Thank you.
I have a question, but I have a comment. This also, in a way, goes to the discussion between Kip and John and Chris. One way to understand, I think this may be downplayed a little bit in the paper, but I think they would be amenable to this. To understand what WBA is, it's a undiscounted sum of a quality-like measure, except that instead of qualities, which represent preferences over health, these are experience. It's kind of an undiscounted sum of experience-adjusted life years, right? And we can think about it this way, and then the question is, why would we like that as opposed to cost-benefit? It seems to me that Kip, a bunch of critiques, but two strike me as being very powerful. One is just the general objection to undiscounted utilitarianism, which is that there is this problem that you then sacrifice the present for the future. This is a deep issue, for example, in debates about undiscounted utilitarianism and climate change. And it seems to me that, you do need to grapple with that. Now, maybe you say, well, we put in the discount rate, but this is, if the view really is a kind of, undiscounted utilitarianism, whether it's quality-adjusted utilitarianism or here experience-adjusted, that's a big issue. The other big issue, which, again, is just to echo something Kip said, in the quality literature, so to press the analogy of qualities, there is so much worry, even among people who like qualities, about how you measure qualities. Do you measure health states on a direct rating scale? Do you measure them using time trade-offs? Do you measure them using standard gambles? These measurement issues seem to matter, and I think Kip's comment about this being 20 years too young is, before we're confident in the use of these happiness surveys for this, again, kind of a quality adjustment to longevity, we need to really worry about issues like ordinality, cardinality, scale compression, and so forth, analogous to all the worrying that occurred in the quality literature. And again, I think that's kind of a friendly amendment, and it, aligns with something that I was saying earlier, that even within the space of experience utilitarianism as opposed to preference utilitarianism, these are really serious worries.
Thank you. Kip, would you like to have a brief response, or would?
Yeah, very briefly. By the way, I don't like qualities either. But anyway, I'll just mention 2 points. First, yes, I mean, my happiness level is higher being alive than dead. But I think there are very few government policies that nudge my happiness score, from 7 to 8 or from 7 to 6. So when they renovated and revitalized downtown Durham, I don't think that was sufficient, even though I think that was a good thing to do. I don't think it moved many people's happiness scores on that scale. Also, in terms of saving the lives of young people versus old people, in the value of statistical life estimates by age, a 62-year-old has a higher value of statistical life than an 18-year-old. So at least the value of statistical life people would be less willing to kill off the older people than the happiness people are. Because if you go back to people's willingness to pay, the willingness to pay does vary across the life cycle, and it varies in such a way that old people's lives actually do count in the value of statistical life approach, actually more so than they would under a happiness approach.
Thank you, Kip. Lisa, in your paper, you argued this isn't a binary question. There's room for cost benefit and well-being analytics. Can you expand on that a bit?
I don't think that, I think that the phrase that comes to mind is, was it some Chinese revolution or something, the many flowers bloom, let many flowers bloom?
1,000, not 2.
What was it?
It was 1,000.
My experience has been that if I walk into a room like this full of people who are thinking about policy, they have lots of divergent interests, lots of divergent goals. You're not dealing with a unitary decision maker who's going to maximize utility or well-being or any qualities, anything else. And so having lots of information at your disposal to share with people who have divergent views, I think can be very useful. And none of these end up being, I don't think any of these things in the real world end up trumping. The decision-making process is a very messy one, and the more information we can bring to bear, I think the better off we are.
Absolutely. All right, so this relates to that and also to your presentation, Lisa. I think Kip may have a reaction to this as well. So, I mean, I actually just want to let one flower bloom. I mean, I'm a preference guy, and again, I will concede that WBA is a really innovative approach if one wants to, either if one says as a philosophical matter that well-being is just experiences, or one says as an empirical matter that people just have preferences for experiences. But it seems to me that if one in general wants to maximize preferences in some sense, the best game in town is CBA, I like distributive weights, but whatever. So I would not, from that point of view, I don't want to let WBA bloom. What I would like to do, this is my last slide, I didn't get to it, is to incorporate mental states of various kinds into willingness to pay. And Lisa touched on this a little bit in your comments. So for example, in valuing the risk of death, we should distinguish between deaths which are not just deaths, but also have lots of, bad effects associated with them, either after, so cancer, both in the sense that cancer involves suffering and in the sense that anticipating cancer involves fear. And in theory, we could build that into our VSLs. You see some of this in fear crime research where people are asked for their willingness to pay for crime reduction measures, and that encompasses not just, increased safety, but decreased fear of crime. So my question for Lisa and Kip is, how far along are we in terms of that? That is incorporating, I would like to, and Gary Becker also said this, and my view is, if Gary Becker said something, me too. So that is that we should view, rather than view happiness as a kind of inclusive measure of well-being, I would view happiness as just one attribute. Mm-hmm. Along with income and leisure and environmental quality and so forth, is an attribute, in the bundle of attributes. But then the question is, so how far along are we in terms of coming up with WT measures for bundles of attributes, including happiness, or fear, or other kinds of affective states?
Can I jump in, Kip, or do you want to jump in first? I think that I think that we're at the aspirational stage. So I've been involved in I've been involved in 3 discussions about what VSL agencies should use recently, one of which Kip was involved in too. And the conclusion, I think in all 3 cases is, as economists, what we'd really like to use is a well-conducted study that looks at the populations that your regulations affect. So if you're writing regulations that primarily affect kids or primarily affect old people, you want a study that addresses that population. And we also want one that addresses the risk that you're addressing. So if you're doing transportation risk, we want a transportation study. If you're doing environmental risk, we want an environmental study. If you're doing terrorism, we want a terrorism study. And what we find is we can't find well-conducted studies that do what we want them to do. In the terrorism case that I used as my example, the sad truth, or maybe it's the happy truth, Kip, is that we ended up recommending one of Kip's wage risk studies, which looks at job-related risk, because there wasn't something else we could use for terrorism, and then we made a statement that we thought that terrorism risk could be as much as a factor of 2 higher. I can't remember the exact phrasing. It was very carefully worded because Kip does have this study where he looked at terrorism risk compared to other types of risks, and it raises some questions about whether the differences really are that large. So I think the answer is we've got a big research gap.
Well, I came up with terrorism risk are valued twice as highly as deaths from hurricanes and other natural disasters. But as to whether happiness is an attribute, I think it's probably a measure of a cluster of attributes. Ideally, though, wouldn't you want the happiness score to be some measure of your utility function, as opposed to a component of utility? So I asked this to the happiness people, since that's not my turf. Matt?
My view is that's problematic, but it's less problematic to say that just as people can, care about, again, consumption and leisure and air quality, people might also care about not being afraid. And I take it again in, VSO for dreaded risks. Implicitly, we're thinking of not just, longevity, but the affective state of being afraid or not as an attribute, not as a measure, as an attribute, which is then the preference utility for which is then estimated using standard methods.
Okay.
Let me shift gears. Jennifer, let me shift gears a little bit, and I have a question for you. A lot of people before this and reading this and students were saying, how would all this work, this trying to introduce objective well-being, analytics into rulemaking? And you addressed some of those issues and some practical issues in that regard, suggesting if I read it more of a bottoms-up type approach, testing it. So, something new like this. Are there certain institutions that you feel would be better suited for this than others?
Yeah, absolutely. So I as already alluded, I think really trying to pick out the agencies that are going to be the most receptive to this kind of piloting project is the way to go. So just as an example, I just mentioned a footnote, but there's this project called Regulation Room. There's all these discussions about how do you get participation and informed participation in the rulemaking process, and that really started at the Department of Transportation. It's just recently moved to the Consumer Financial the CFPB, Bureau, and as a result of that piloting, there's a series of papers that tries to use the data and kind of the analysis that have come out of that to inform future projects, and I think that iterative process is really fruitful. One other thing I'd just say is that the papers also make clear that there are specific data sources that are probably kind of more robust than others. So we've heard a lot, for example, about unemployment effects and its effects on hedonic measures, and you might think, well, maybe something like Department of Labor, is the right agency to sort of think about implementing WBA and trying to get the right kinds of groups of people together to talk through these issues.
So certain rules might be better subjects than others.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and particular agencies.
You want to preempt that other question?
Just get it back.
I just want to return quickly to sort of one thing that Matt said and one thing that Kip said. On the point that Matt made about discounting, I'm not sure why everyone keeps saying that we believe in no discount rate. We say the opposite in the paper. We're just saying that if you're not using money, you don't have to worry about the time value of money because you're not using money, but you might very well want to discount for all sorts of other reasons which have been well expressed. So I think that's I'm not quite sure why that keeps coming up. Kip, I think your questions about sort of the coarseness of the measure are really important. I wanted to say one more quick thing about that, which is, so it might be, let's say that you seem like a very happy person. Generally, let's say you're an 8 overall. And perhaps it's the case that, if we only let you choose whole numbers, nothing would ever, nothing the government has done has ever really budged you off of that 8. But nonetheless, that's the way that we envision collecting data about this is not just sort of saying to people at the end of a year or the end of a decade, what number would you give yourself? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. More to the point, we would ask people sort of on an ongoing basis, how happy are you right now? What are you doing right now? So let's say that you are, generally speaking, an 8 when you're in Nashville, but a 9 when you're in Breckenridge. And let's say that the government, imposes some new sort of security measure that makes traveling through airports very, very time-consuming, and it reduces the number of weekends that you can spend in Colorado each year by 1. Well, if we were sampling appropriately, we would, the data would pick that up, and it would see that there were a couple days a year when you were in Nashville, but you could have been in Colorado, and so your overall well-being would drop by some decimal amount as a result of that. And if we looked, if there were lots of people like you experiencing lots of things like that, we'd pick up even small changes in the data just because we're asking the question sort of how are you doing right now over long spans of time. So I think that your question highlights the importance of collecting kind of fine-grained ongoing data, but that's already in progress. People are already engaging in data collection like that, and that's exactly what we would advocate continuing.
Go ahead, and then we have a question back
Well,
here.
no, I want to let somebody else talk, but then I'll follow up.
All right, let's have some questions from back here. That'd be great. Give everybody a chance to wrap up
Yeah.
near the end.
Oh, I'm okay. Lisa had some thoughts.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was hoping to listen to somebody other than me talk.
Questions from the law student? Not one. Can I call on anybody? Okay, fine.
Jonathan.
You're not a law student.
Well, two thoughts. One is that it seems to me that one of the most powerful points in the Bronstein, Buck-Fusco, and Mazur paper is the drawing on the literature from Dan Gilbert and others about the errors in anticipated or forecast, says it's on, anticipated or forecast measures of preferences. And so it could be useful in what Matt Adler is calling a preference-based approach to elicit assessments that are also experienced preferences, so rather than only anticipated preferences. And so I wonder if that's a point of common ground among the players and how that would actually work in a concrete, practical way. The second question is, I was intrigued by Jennifer Nou's suggestion that maybe different institutions should use different types of analysis. And I'm wondering if Jennifer wants to say more about that, or others about, for example, should the Congress, Congress right now in the United States doesn't have any regularized form of any of these analyses for its legislative projects. So there's no cost-benefit or well-being or other analysis required by Congress of its own enactments. Now, you may think that's obvious, but in the European Union, the impact assessment system is for legislative enactments. So it's certainly possible for a legislature to adopt some system. So if Congress were thinking of doing that, and there have been proposals in the past in the US Congress to create a Congressional Office of Regulatory Analysis or something like that, what method should they use? And maybe would some variant be more suitable for Congress than for the administrative agencies? Similarly, we could ask that about the courts, whether courts should pay attention to one or another of these approaches. And that might relate also, thinking of the courts, puts further emphasis on the ex post analysis, since many judicial decisions are after implementation or after the injury has occurred in the case of tort law. So I just wanted to raise those two basic kinds of questions. One about, is there common ground in experienced preference And second, if different institutions could make better use of different kinds of analytic approaches. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think your point about Congress is absolutely right. And with maybe the caveat that I think there are some statutes that you could understand as Congress's attempts to sort of evaluate costs and benefits in particular realms. I'm thinking like the Unfunded Mandates Act, for example, right? So MGA was supposed to get those reports. Now it's a different question of whether they're actually used. And I think a lot of people would say they're not. But I think, it's interesting to think through, like, why don't we have those kinds of statutes? And we could go through either, it's costly to implement them, what are we going to do with them? And you have, different, Congresses throughout time might, have different views about the costs and benefits. We could, that discussion would be a fruitful one. But relatedly, I also wonder, we haven't talked about it as much, but there are particular kinds of risks that, are not kind of debiased. And so but there might be the kind of risks that, we don't want, to talk about in the institution of Congress because, a lot of people criticize, like legislative hearings, for example, for being more theatrical rather than actually substantive, right? Maybe the role of experts, is muted in Congress. And so maybe that's sort of the last stop for particular issues to be debated. I could imagine that to be another dimension along which we might want to think about the variation within institutions and across them.
Kip, your commentary is critical, as we know, of the use of well-being measures and cost-benefit analyses. Do you think well-being measures have any useful role?
Well, I think my response to that's also going to pick up on a theme in what Jonathan just said regarding experience preferences. So a lot of the well-being analyses focus on hedonic adaptation. So after you've suffered a disability, it's not as bad as you might think it was going to be. And there actually is common ground here. Back when I was at Duke, Frank Sloan and I wrote a paper back in '98 for multiple sclerosis. So we told healthy people, here are the symptoms of multiple sclerosis. Would you be willing to undergo some operation that had a particular probability of death, but if it succeeded, you would live. So it's the kill you or cure you type of thing. And we also ran the same survey on people who actually had multiple sclerosis. And what we found is that, consistent with the hedonic adaptation approach, people who actually had multiple sclerosis were less willing to undergo the kill you or cure you operation than the people who were told what the disease would mean to them, ex ante. So I think that, the happiness literature can be useful in highlighting situations such as that, but we can also get a handle on it using standard methodologies. Let me also add that my doctoral dissertation focused on job satisfaction, which is basically a happiness measure of how workers felt about the jobs. And what I did is I corroborated that with whether workers actually quit their jobs. I think the same sort of thing might be useful for the happiness literature, trying to corroborate these ordinal scales with concrete behavior as a way to validate the scale and show its applicability.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
Yes. Kip, this goes with respect to your discussion of discount rates and with respect to well-being analysis. And I guess my question is should we really consider happiness to be a good that should be discounted? In other words, if you were to say give someone $100 today versus $100 a year from today, would they necessarily? They might actually receive a greater amount of happiness from receiving the $100 in the future because of their anticipation of receiving those funds at that moment versus just getting those funds at day one. And my other thought on that is that is happiness kind of an ephemeral good? I mean, once let's say you have a day that is 10 out of 10, but then once you have that, does that have meaning for the rest of your life? Do you then kind of reframe in terms of the adaptation effects that we were talking about? Do we, in fact, want people to be unhappy when they're younger so that they can be more happy when they're older? Thank you.
Well, they've actually run experiments we've given people the opportunity to have money now, or they can be paid at the end of the year. And hands down, people want the money up front. In fact, perhaps irrationally so. So they reflect, usually these experiments indicate relatively high rates of discount. What the happiness folks want to do with discounting is up to them. I mean, in the example in their paper, they just multiplied 7.4 by the number of years of remaining life. And if you're not going to if you don't discount happiness, then you have this kinds of paradoxes that I pointed out, which is that if you can invest your money, even if it doesn't get cheaper to save lives, if you can invest your money, it always pays to postpone saving people's lives, because you can save more people's lives by waiting 100 years after you've invested the money. And if the cost of lives has gone down, saving lives has gone down, you'll be doubly blessed in terms of being able to save people's lives.
I wanted to reflect a little bit on Professor Wiener's point about thinking about these situations that Matt, I think, earlier described as ones in which people might have both preferences for some sets of goods intrinsically, as well as those same goods for extrinsic or happiness reasons. And one of the things that we focused on in our research so far is situations in which people might be making affective forecasting errors with respect to the well-being that they get from these types of these values, these goods. But even aside from that, it might be that people are making poor decisions with respect to the value of those goods intrinsically. Right? So whatever it is that people value about freedom, or value about liberty, or value about health as an intrinsic rather than as an extrinsic matter, they still might be doing that poorly as well. And that's an empirical question, and one that I think is subject to both experimental and empirical data. And if people are making mistakes about those kinds of things, those are the kind, and it might be that one of the ways in which they're making mistakes about those kinds of things is that, the extrinsic aspects of them feed into, or there's a relationship between the intrinsic and the extrinsic value that people hold for those kinds of goods. And when they learn about the extrinsic experience, maybe their value intrinsically for those goods also is different, right? So maybe once you learn, perhaps not that your kids don't make you as happy as you thought they were, but perhaps, that your liberty or freedom interest might be less valuable extrinsically than you thought. It might be that it is also less valuable intrinsically than you thought. Or maybe vice versa. This is, I think, again, an empirical question.
Thanks for that. Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I think it relates also to what Jonathan was bringing up. So it seems to me if people had, individuals had limitless cognitive capacities and empathetic capacities, the way you would elicit preference utility would be by describing, different sort of fully specified counterfactuals. So imagine a future in which all these things happen to you, as opposed to this other future. Think hard about it, think with full information, really reflect on it, which do you prefer? By doing that, we're washing out the kind of predictive worry that you're pointing to. We're not getting their ex-ante predictions about what's going to happen as a result of one or another unspecified choice, or rather getting their intrinsic preference for these different fully specified futures. Now, two problems with that. One is that, and that it's a kind of contingent valuation of state of preference survey. You could do that in a dichotomous choice mode. You'd be worried about whether people were sort of lying to you for strategic reasons. But leaving that aside, it's not that different than at least in terms of the ranking or choice mode, than what you see in stated preference research. But the problem is we can't do that. One is because it's difficult to get people to think about these fully specified futures, and so instead we give them underspecified choices, and then the worry is people might prefer this as opposed to that because of a misprediction about the result of that, whether it's a result in terms of happiness or in terms of other kinds of intrinsically valued attributes. The other worry, which goes to what Kip was talking about, which also goes to, so Kip's study that he talked about is very much like the study that Peter Ubel talked about getting both members of the general population and colostomy patients to value colostomies, is the empathy point. It's very difficult for people to really understand what it would be like to experience different kinds of futures. So insofar as what you're describing is you're going to get this and this and this and this and this, and you're going to feel this way, right? To make that credible is really, really difficult. But yeah, I mean, it's, if we were, as our cognitive and emotional capacities expand, it seems to me that's the way you elicit preference utility, as opposed to a kind of ex-ante prediction, which brings in, the things, the sorts of things that you Jonathan, were worrying about.
Lisa.
I wanted to go back, maybe weave between several things that different people said, because I think that, this conversation in general, we've been wavering or varying in terms of whether we're talking about major federal regulations, other types of government policies like the draft, projects like building a bridge. And I think how we use both benefit cost analysis and well-being analysis does vary by those contexts. But when we're talking about major regulations, I think part of the reason why Kip or I or any of us might not see them as noticeably affecting their happiness is that most of these huge regulations get large costs and benefits because they have very, very small impacts on many people. You are probably not going to notice I think one of the largest regulations to come through lately are the particulate matter national ambient air quality standards. I don't think any of us are going to notice that our air quality is getting better because of that, and it would be very hard to pick up on a well-being scale. It also makes it very hard to get values when you're doing benefit cost analysis because you need to figure out, people who do these sorts of surveys have had to work very hard to figure out how to communicate small changes. And I think it relates to the effective forecasting issue that Jonathan was raising, because we might be able to say something about effective forecasting when we're talking about, whether or not you have cancer or some sort of respiratory or heart disease. But to talk about effective forecasting in terms of understanding that 1 in 10,000 change in the risk of those diseases, it's, I think, going to be a very tough problem. I think there's a bigger point here, though, that regardless of whether we're trying to value whole cases, going from a state of not having an illness to having an illness or being alive to being dead, or these small changes, one thing that I think the example in your paper points out is that I think a next step in some ways would be to create some sort of dictionary or encyclopedia maybe of all the endpoints that we care about, for example, in regulatory analysis, if that's your main focus, and to see the extent to which you have well-being measures of any sort that actually get at those. Because my sense from looking at the example, and I don't know the well-being literature as well as many of the people in the room do, is that for the sorts of changes that we're looking at in regulatory analysis, even if we don't think about risk, we just think about it as a whether or not you have chronic bronchitis, that we don't have well-being measures for a lot of those, and that's something that would have to develop in order to implement the process.
Questions? All right, as we near the end here, I'd like to at least give our sets of authors a chance to make some sort of final statement, and then each panelist to respond. You've made plenty of statements.
I'd like to say thank you again. Yes. We can't be thankful enough for everyone's hard work and everyone's willingness to come out and engage with this work. So thank you.
Well, we certainly thank you and for your active engagement in your great paper. Matt?
Yeah, thank you very much. thanks so much to the panelists and to the law review for putting together the day. I mean, at least from my perspective, it went, again, as I said before, I'm kind of a depressive pessimist, so it went a lot better than I expected. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Jennifer?
I don't have much to add except to say the same.
You can tell it's Friday afternoon, can't you? Lisa, would you?
I just repeat everything everybody said. Thank you to Duke for hosting us. It's been great to be here.
Kip?
It's great to be back at Duke, in spirit at least. Let me just say that I think the happiness people might want to take a page out of the contingent valuation literature book, in that the stated preference literature now, or that whole field is viewed as more credible than it was long ago. And I think that incorporating more rationality tests, consistency tests, and other kinds of ways to verify the methodology would probably bolster its acceptance more broadly and increase its usefulness in regulatory contexts as well as in economic studies generally.
Thank you, Kip. Thank you very much. And I will note, it's interesting to me, as I guess, quote, a happiness person by scholarship and education, you are the only person today who just actually said, here's something that makes me happy, when you said you're looking out the window and seeing all that snow. So thank you for applying a happiness measure in your own life and experience and sharing it with the panel. Thank you so much to our panelists, our authors. Thank you for allowing me. Thank you. Yes, please. And thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me to moderate this and invite you. It's been a wonderful day for all.
Okay, so the agenda says closing remarks. I think the only closing remark I have is to thank everybody, since we're thanking everybody, for being here. It really was a fantastic day, and I think everyone can be happy that we all have about 10 minutes of our lives that are free now. So we're done a little early, but I think that's okay. Safe travels to all of our authors and panelists. We really appreciate your presence and look forward to editing your pieces when they come back. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.